Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on law enforcement and public health and broadening the evidence base of the field. I'm Isabelle Barkoviak-Theron, and I am, it's very early here in Australia. It's 6 o'clock in Tasmania, in Melbourne. It is customary in Australia to do an acknowledgement of country before we have any kind of meeting or session. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm convening this magnificent workshop and pay my respects to the Moanina people and their elders past, present and future. I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to this workshop, which has as a purpose the idea of developing an evidence base for law enforcement and public health and how the concept of vulnerability can help with this. We have had this conference for a really long time now. The first conference was almost 10 years ago, and we keep on bringing to the fore a number of issues that we have difficulties doing. Things like reconciling, of course, the two fields and bridging the operational or policy gaps between law enforcement and public health, but also designing specific performance indicators or specific benchmarks for us to move forward practice towards best practice or evidence-based practice. So I have, and I'm really delighted to have this panel, to introduce you to this panel. I've got some speakers with me who I am in awe of. I highly respect the people who are going to talk today. We've got an international panel, which I love. This is one of the things about this conference that I absolutely love. I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you, but we've got people from Scotland, from England, from Canada, and of course, we've got two of us from Australia here. So I like the idea that we are antipodian in this session. However late it is over there in England for you and however early it is for us. So I'll let everyone introduce themselves just in a second in the order of faces that I've got on my screen right now. So as I was saying, I'm Isabelle Barkoviak-Theron. I am a senior researcher with the Tasmanian Institute of Law Enforcement Studies at the University of Tasmania. And in my research capacity, I manage the specific portfolios of law enforcement and public health, vulnerability, and police education. The education side of things being quite crucial to my work because I teach police recruits here in Tasmania Police, particularly in the field of vulnerability and their interaction with vulnerable people. But enough about myself. It's not about me, myself, and I, but the wonderful contributors to the workshop that I've got. I will let Robert introduce himself, and then Shelley, Inga, Dan, Emma, and Jen.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. So my name is Robert Skinner. I'm a research associate at Heriot-Watt University. I work there part-time, but I'm also a practicing sign language interpreter, and my areas of specialism as an interpreter includes mental health, so inpatient, outpatients, political settings, interpreting online services and policing. And my research has mainly been looking at how interpreters work with the police so that their services are made more accessible for deaf people, and also looking at using technology to improve the way that deaf people can access public services.
Thanks, Robert. Hello, everyone. My name is Shelley Turner. I'm an adjunct senior lecturer at Monash University and also an adjunct research fellow at Swinburne University in the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science. But my day job is actually as the Chief Social Worker for the Victorian Institute of Mental Health, which is also known as Forensic Care. But today I'm coming to you in my capacity as an adjunct academic. My teaching experience has really centred on the intersection of criminal justice and social work, mental health, drug and alcohol work as well. And I'm particularly interested in direct communication and practice skills for working effectively with people who are involuntary clients in a range of different settings. And in particular, my years of experience have really focused on and worked in youth justice settings. So I'm particularly interested in that across the developmental life course and issues of vulnerability that come across those different various times of our lives. So today I'm really going to be focusing on some of those evidence-based communication skills and how they might be relevant to the field of law enforcement and public health. Looking forward to it.
Hi, my name is Inga Heyman. I'm a mental health nurse of 40 years. Most of my clinical experience was in Australia, but I'm back in Scotland now, work at the university in Edinburgh Napier University, where I co-direct the Scottish Centre for Law Enforcement and Public Health. Most of my research has been focused on mental health pathways with police, and I work quite closely with Police Scotland. I also had the joy of, and I mean it, the joy of hosting the conference in 2019, the Law Enforcement and Public Health Conference in 2019, which was just the best thing to be able to be involved in, and it was an absolute privilege to be able to welcome everybody to Edinburgh. But in saying that, Jennifer Wood has raised the bar, and this conference has just been unbelievable, and so yeah, so it's joyous to be here. Thank you.
I think I was supposed to go next. I was trying to remember. Sometimes I don't remember things very well. My name is Dan Jones. I'm an inspector of the Edmonton Police Service, and my role there is in charge of actually a new research area. But I'm also very fortunate to have gotten to go to school in the UK. So I did my master's degree at the University of Cambridge, and I'm doing my PhD in the University of Huddersfield. And my area of research is the victim offender overlap, looking at how individuals experience trauma and victimization and then become incarcerated, and how that over their life course impacts them. And a lot of what we look at is vulnerability and how we can change interventions to try to do things differently and better for that population. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Emma Williams. I'm currently working at the Centre for Police Research and Learning at the Open University, where I am the Director of Research and Police Partnerships there. So I kind of act as a conduit, if you like, between the academics involved in police research and our partners, of which there are 22 forces across the UK and Wales within our partnership. So it's a fantastic role in terms of getting a view across the whole country around what's going on with research, but also getting involved in lots of different areas of research. My area of interest is predominantly rape investigation, which is where my interest in vulnerability became kind of grounded, I guess, and also police professionalisation. And the paper that myself and my colleague Jenny will talk about today is bringing those two issues together. So how professionalisation should be focused on embedding an understanding of vulnerability from the very start of officers' careers. And I think that's where I see my two kind of areas, my two worlds, if you like, research-wise coming together. I'm really chuffed to be here. I was very lucky to be at the last conference in Scotland, where I was delivering a paper on areas of custody and vulnerability. So it's just fantastic to be here. I just wish we were really there. Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, I'd completely echo that, Emma. Yes, thanks, Isa, for setting up the panel and inviting us on it this evening. My name's Jenny Norman. I'm a senior lecturer at the Open University situated in the UK. I work within the policing organisations and practice departments, and lead and am involved in the delivery and design of policing degrees. Again, my research interests are particularly around professionalisation and the role of police education and how that plays out into practice. I've been involved in several pieces of work around vulnerability and rape, and have been lucky to do that with my colleague Emma on the panel. And as she's already sort of described, we're kind of marrying up the two in relation to vulnerability and how that plays out in the police curriculum today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you all for those very prompt introductions. That's what I love about this panel. We're so very disciplined in that on that front. Some of you might notice that two of our conveners are not here today, and I have to provide some apologies on behalf of Associate Professor Jennifer Murray and Professor Nicholas Quith, who are both very unwell. So we wish them well. And I have promised that I would convene on their behalf and channel my inner Jen and my inner Nicole. And on that point, Nicole gave me a bit of a call yesterday. She wishes us all the best for this workshop. And she wanted me to say the following, because of course, when Nicole gives me a call, it's sometimes with directives attached to it. So what she really was insisting on, what she was about to insist on if she was convening with us today, was the fact that we have a tendency to imply vulnerability when it's actually not guaranteed. And what she wanted to think about was how vulnerability coordinates across the field, and that vulnerability is not something that we can tick off on a spreadsheet or on a form for the government. We have to resolve the various situational threats and the exposure to harm and the inability of people to cope with those threats. So she wanted us to also consider the kinds of harms that people are exposed to by virtue of their own exposure to the system through which they're going. So either policing and criminal justice, of course. So what we want to do today, and we will start with Inga. The way it's going to go is that we're each going to talk for about 5-10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussions and either amongst ourselves or with the Q&A. You've got the Q&A chat just below, or raise your hand if you want to be unmuted and ask your questions directly. Please do this as we speak, and I will collect the questions as we go and ask them on your behalf at the end of our presentation. So we're each going to talk for a few minutes, and then after that we'll talk. So we're going to each talk about specific examples or ideas about practice that we think can underpin the development of that evidence base for law enforcement and public health, and analyze how those examples actually are strong enough or too weak to help develop that that evidence base, and of course suggest a path forward. Full disclosure here, there might be papers coming out of this session, and this is also, in a way, the discussion afterwards will be some kind of a brainstorming as to what we go from there, but there will be further outcomes after this session too. So without further ado, Inga, it's so lovely to see you. I can't wait. Of course, we've prepared a little bit before, and we had a bit of a Zoom brainstorm before the session, but I can't wait to hear what else you've got to say today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. Well, one of the things that we'd been speaking about in our Zoom session was that there was sort of an impression that Scotland was quite forward thinking in as far as coming together with law enforcement and public health. And when I saw that on paper, I was thinking, when you're actually living in it, you think, are we really? Do you know, are we really? And I started trying to unpick a little bit about what has happened. And I've sort of been around long enough to see that there's probably a bit of a lining of stars or moons at the moment, or planets is the word I'm looking for, a lining of planets that have happened in the last number of years that have really sort of made law enforcement and public health come together and academia come together quite cohesively in some ways. One of the things I think, well, I was kind of sort of listing them in my head, what they were, or what those elements were. I think the very first thing is to acknowledge that actually we've got some fairly major societal inequalities in Scotland that we're particularly well known for. So, we've got really high rates, the highest rates of drug-related deaths in Europe. We have, despite a massive efforts by Scottish Government to lower our deaths of people who die by suicide, we've recently seen a rise in that as well. So, there are some really underpinning inequalities that have really shifted some of our thinking, that we think, actually, we need to do something very differently, and we need to be really bold around this. And I think COVID really highlighted and put a real lens on inequalities in Scotland and made us start to think, actually, we've got an opportunity here to really turn this on its head and think differently. And it's really sparked a real flame of wanting to do things differently, both in Public Health Scotland, which is just newly formed or reformed, but also in Police Scotland and also in academia. So there was a few things that were coming together at one time. One of the things that's been really, I think has been really, really important is the leadership, both in Police Scotland and Public Health Scotland, really passionate leaders in both areas. And they've really developed strong partnerships, and partnerships with real meaning and desire to change, not partnerships for the sake of saying it's a partnership. And so they hold, you know, sort of collaborative partnership events, which really are starting to dig into those problems. Scottish Government also put together a board in the Health and Justice Collaboration Board, which is the leaders the leader in Police Scotland, the leader in health, in NHS, ambulance service, fire services, pulled everybody together and asked them to identify the 3 top priorities to work on. And one of them was mental health pathways, which is why we've seen a real push in that. So the leadership is really strong. And within Police Scotland, particularly, there's a whole division has been developed around partnerships and in really moving that forward. And the lead, you know, through that whole team, which is the most impressive group of people, the Assistant Chief Constable Gary Ritchie, who leads on that, is just amazing. Claire Thompson, who manages that whole process. They are the most easy to work with. They're really build relationships that are not just, you know, the Friends Club. They're actually quite critical, and we have some really rich conversations. So the leadership's been really important. And I think one of the things is often in policing, you'll see people be moved out of a place really quite quickly. You just get to know them and then they're off. I think there's been acknowledgement that you stick people in one area. So I think that's been really important. And so they take very much a systems approach to how they're working. So they've really changed the thinking around that and looking at the intersecting systems and how that is actually being managed. I think one of the other things is that there are other groups within that, so particularly SIPR, the Scottish Institute of Police and Research, so that's headed up by Liz Aston, but within that there's a very specific group who work on education and leadership, so that's Denise Martin and Andrew Wolfe, and they've just done this amazing amount of work. So there's this real drive within areas that are all coming together that seem to have really ignited this passion for these relationships to work. We've also, you know, SCLEPH, we've developed, and just because we've just found by chance a group of people who are really passionate about the same thing. So, you know, there's been a line in our planets, I keep saying that. But I think the thing that underpins the whole lot, there is a real honesty of we have got so much work to do. There is so much still to go. Nobody sits and rests in the laurels in any of this work. It's on to the next thing, and there's, you know, that will keep going. So I think it's about relationships. There are gaps in the system, and that's the stuff that I sort of write about and think about very much, not just about the gaps that are there because things never quite connect, or there is not a service there for a particular group of people. But it's also how we behave or working within those gaps are really important. And so the things that drive us in opposition, so the, you know, health, you know, from a mental health perspective, we come very much from working with on a strengths-based approach. When we're working with somebody, it's really looking at their strengths, and we're thinking about recovery and moving forward. Whereas in policing, often it's much more a risk-averse, crisis-driven, you know, let's just get the case get on to the next job. You know, let's get that ticked off and that person safe for now. Whereas we think quite differently. And so there's a push and pull there that can lose that person in between and actually make them more vulnerable and traumatize them more. I believe that people can be more harmed coming into our systems. The good thing is we're starting to look at that, and you know, again, Police Scotland's really inviting academia into their work. Like, so we're really sit on the table. You know, tomorrow I'm sitting on the mental health governance group for Police Scotland. They really invite academia in there, and so there's a willingness. So I'm going to finish there, but it's not all joy, but there is a lot of joy in it.
Thanks, Inga. I just want to let you know that I'm taking copious notes and jotting down my questions as I go. For each of you, taking chair privilege, really. So I'll ask them at the end, and of course I'll give priority to the audience more than anything. Next of the rank is Shelley, who's joining us from Melbourne, across the Bass Strait from us. Hi, Shell.
Yes, hi everyone. It was remiss of me earlier not to acknowledge as well that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nations. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present here, and also to note that the lands that I'm on have never been ceded and there hasn't been a treaty here. So look, I want to pick up on some of the themes that Inga's raised in her talk, and also just to think a little on the notion of partnerships. Some 15 years ago, I found myself as the clinical and operational manager of Australia's first youth drug and alcohol court program. And this for me really brought to light what partnerships look like on the ground. So while we often talk about partnerships in a big picture sense, I think when you really see it in your face, what it looks like from person to person and organisation to organisation, it brings up some very interesting issues for practice, but also for theory. And I think when some of those issues that Inga raised around the different emphasis of various professions that are in this space, so the police thinking about risk, maybe social workers thinking about rehabilitation, those are some of the differences I want to think about, but also try to find some of the commonalities for how we might make these partnerships ultimately work. And in thinking about this panel, I've also been thinking a lot around global conceptualizations and how different jurisdictions think about the work in law enforcement and public health. So if you think about recent calls for defunding the police, for example, and calls for having social workers and police working together in schools, you often see that there's an intersection between these players of police officers, social workers, and also I would add probation officers in there. I think about Scotland in particular being one of the only jurisdictions to have criminal justice social workers rather than probation officers. And I think that really tells you something about how they see and how they're conceptualizing the work and the skill set and the capabilities that are needed in that space. But before I think about commonalities, I just want to think a little bit about symbolic points of difference. So when you think about police and their symbols, you sometimes think about the badge, the gun, the various tools that they will use for their job and to help with law enforcement. Now, I know that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Not every police officer will hold a gun, but there will always be very clear official symbols that are visual. When you think about probation officers in some jurisdictions, there are guns as well, and uniforms and various symbols of authority. When you think about social workers, sadly, you often think about a lanyard and maybe a clipboard, or these days an iPad or an iPhone of some description, but really no weapons or no real means to help with the law enforcement element of statutory social work or of the work that social workers perform in criminal justice. And I often think this is quite interesting because we're working in very much the same spaces as police officers and probation officers. We're working with the same populations. We're working in the community where it can be volatile. And we're also working in institutions like prisons and in courtrooms we're in police cells, we're in all sorts of spaces together. And so what is it that makes this so different? Why do we feel social workers don't need these particular tools and we feel that other professions in these areas do? And this got me thinking about what is it that perhaps the skill set that social workers and probation officers can bring to the space. So I think the shared area of focus here is that we've all got an interest in a sense, promoting compliance. We want to promote compliance with law enforcement measures, and we want to promote compliance with public health measures. And so what is the evidence base for how we do that? How do we achieve that? And how do social workers look at this as well? So the evidence about compliance really sits in areas about perceptions of legitimacy of authority. So when somebody sees the authority as legitimate, then they're more likely to comply. And this is the same for social workers who are working from a model of care and control in these spaces. They're really about trying to use their authority in a way that that will promote compliance with, say, a bail order or a probation order, or even a treatment order of some description. And this is, we're all trying to achieve this element of compliance. So I think the commonality in these partnerships between police, probation, social workers, however it's conceptualized in the jurisdiction, really hinges on this body of evidence that we know is about promoting compliance and achieving positive perceptions of the legitimacy of the authority. We know, for example, from Mazerol's work and the colleague that procedural justice is really important for police in promoting legitimacy, a sense of legitimacy. So modeling what's expected, the behaviour, you know, promoting the respect and dignity of the person that they're interacting with. And again, I'm struck by how even when we're talking about partnerships on a larger level, it will still often come down to that moment between two individuals or groups and what happens in that space, in that interaction. So we're talking here about promoting respect and dignity of the person, even in very unsettling circumstances, in crisis-driven moments. There are still ways that we can try to work to maintain somebody's respect and dignity. I think particularly my own work in forensic mental health, there are times where you see people's dignity stripped bare. And the workers who do this well are the ones who do continue to try to maintain someone's dignity, even in the most dire circumstances. The second element, of course, is to have genuine motives and trustworthy motives, to go into this work of law enforcement and public health with the genuine best interests of others at heart. And this speaks to the importance of training and education, but also recruitment and what we're looking for in our law enforcement personnel. And a neutral and non-judgmental approach, which is critical for social workers as well. Social workers are often coming up against things that challenge their own value systems. In fact, I would say that working in law enforcement and statutory settings often challenges the value base of social workers. So finding a way to do that in a way where you don't lose your moral compass in that space and are able to maintain as much as possible a non-biased approach is really important as well. And then finally, I think the last element of procedural justice, so these are the 4 principles that Mazerol and her colleagues have identified, is the importance of trying to give voice and have a participatory approach in the people you're working with. I would argue this is especially important for children and young people who, you know, sometimes for the first time will have an interaction with the criminal justice system through the police. So how they experience that is going to be critical in how they go on to develop a sense of legitimacy of authority. And so in that, I think that we can have some important learnings from the work of Marion Bogo in Canada, who's a social worker who works in field education and has looked at the idea of a holistic competency. So the importance of training people to have procedural skills in communication, so the ability to communicate clearly and well, and these are things we learn in social work interview skills, but also, and really importantly, the element of meta competencies, which is about critical thinking, being able to be reflexive and think on the spot and have some dynamic decision making. So these are the learnings that I feel are important. And one of the other elements I want to end on is that often these ideas important interpersonal and communication skills are referred to as soft skills, which sort of relegates them to a second-rate set of skills. They're not as important as your core skills or your security or risk assessment skills, for example. But I would actually argue that they're quite hard to do. They're very hard to do, and they are core skills. So I'm going to leave you on that note, because I think I might have exhausted my 5 minutes already. I'll come back to discussion.
You did really well. You did really well, Shelley. We're so good at keeping time right now. And I'm sure that Sarah, our moderator, will tell us off if we go beyond, but we're doing really well. Thank you so much. That was very useful. Lots of notes on my end as well. Emma, Jenny, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Isa. Jenny, do you want to use the PowerPoint, or shall we try to crack on without it? Oh, we're using the PowerPoint. Great. Thanks, Jen. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak at this conference. I guess myself and Jenny are coming at this from a slightly different perspective, in that we've got, as we mentioned, experience in both police professionalisation and also doing research within the area of vulnerability. And I think what we're talking about here is the opportunity that our police education qualification framework, which has been implemented in the UK, which is essentially about standardising police education and training, but how that offers an opportunity to change the way that police officers think about public health and, in this case, vulnerability, from the very start of their journey, if you like, as a police officer. And I think that's kind of where our discussion sits within that whole, how can we ensure that this opportunity is delivered, because it is really, really important that it is. So I think it really links well actually with what Shelley was saying about training and getting that right, and also it really rings true in some of the things Inga was saying as well, about the push and pull and that conflict, if you like, between what police see as important outcomes compared to public health agencies. So that's kind of where we're coming from. So Jen, can you just move on to the next slide? I think I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategic context and why this is important, and then I'll hand over to Jenny. But I think probably the most important area of this is getting this wrong, and we all know this already, can further compound the issues around vulnerability. So I'll give you two examples. Jenny and I both were involved in some incredibly good research on rape investigation, where it was very clear that women and men who had particular vulnerabilities linked to public health issues, so mental health, drug and alcohol addiction, were much more likely to be unable to access justice as a result, because the police simply didn't really know what to do with them. They presented more problems for the police than sometimes were they were able to deal with, and therefore, unfortunately, these cases fell out of the system. And the access to justice just wasn't there. Similarly, on the kind of offender base, I guess, we also together, we seem to do everything together. We're involved in some work quite recently looking at drug markets in London, and we really found some issues around young people, particularly involved in county lines and drug dealing in the UK, and the sometimes difficulty that police had in seeing these people as victims of something rather than being just simply offenders. And again, that issue around how that kind of compounds their vulnerability, because essentially they end up in a criminal justice system which is detrimental to them in so many ways. So I think on the back of that, the UK and with thanks to the College of Policing, have launched a vulnerability knowledge and practice programme to try and thread vulnerability right through the core of everything that the police do. And if you haven't seen the action plan through this conference, because I'm sure there have been people talking about the VKPP, there are a strong and really important list of actions that police are meant to be doing, but I think what we're concerned about, and again, Inga and Shelley, you've alluded to this, is that vulnerability becomes another tick box. It becomes another thing that's separate to actually thinking about this as the very, very core of what the police be doing in everything they do, whether it's a response to something, an investigation. It's considered at every stage of the way. And I think, there is a commitment with the violence reduction units to start thinking about this with an interagency approach between police and public health. And it's about identifying vulnerability early, access to justice issues, and recognising safeguarding issues as opposed to criminalisation. And there's a lot going on in the UK context. But I think in the kind of position that we're going to talk through today in relation to the curriculum and threading this into the police skill set at the very, very beginning of their career, we think there are probably still some issues there. So I'll hand over now to Jenny to talk that through.
Just working how to unmute myself. I'm assuming everyone can hear me now. Yeah, thanks, Emma. Yeah, so what I wanted to do is to sort of give a little bit of context around police education in the UK, first of all, and then really think about some of our early observations of the curriculum that has been being rolled out now in England and Wales in the context of vulnerability. The College of Policing, it's the professional body for those who are part of the audience who don't know the context in England and Wales. The college set the professional standards across policing, and they've been involved in embedding several strands of work to enable the standards to be set. One of these strands of work is the police education qualification framework. And through the reform and the framework, there's been a standard set that all incoming officers, all new recruits into the profession must have a degree level qualification. So officers can join policing if they have either completed successfully a pre-join 3-year degree. They can join on entry, but if they are committed to a degree holder entry programme, or they can join on entry if they are an apprentice on the police constable degree apprentice programme. And all three of these programmes are the 3 routes into policing. All 3 of these programmes are underpinned by the national police curriculum. And our observations through our talk today are based on the national police curriculum, which has been devised by the College of Policing. So the first thing I think is really important to say is that there has been a real concerted effort to kind of move police training on from that really transactional, like the traditional police environment in a classroom, and move to more of an ethos of education where those critical thinking skills can be nurtured and developed, those analytical skills, the problems, those soft skills that Shelley was referring to in her speech can be developed and nurtured, and of course bringing that evidence base, that research base into the curriculum. So there's lots to celebrate here in many respects. To be fair, the universities, they've partnered with forces, they've working really, really hard to deliver this new reform in policing. But as mentioned, we wanted to look at the curriculum with a little bit more of a critique in the context of vulnerability, to sort of play out whether or not it addresses vulnerability sufficiently. And we've got 3 kind of observations that we're making today. So first of all, the first observation is that the police national curriculum sets out a modular approach to all aspects of policing, which is unsurprising in an undergraduate degree. So there's a module on community policing, there's a module on intelligence and information, on problem solving, on evidence-based policing, on investigations, and there's a discrete module in vulnerability. Interestingly, there are threads of vulnerability in some of those modules, but to an extent. And I think it's really important to kind of say that the curriculum is so vast. It has so many learning objectives and so many areas for minimum content that universities in the design of the curriculum have to meet, that some of those nuances get diluted, and it becomes quite a prescriptive approach, and you know, arguably could be a danger for a tick box exercise. The other thing is that vulnerability doesn't feature in the curriculum in year 3, so we're putting in vulnerability into boxes, and this actually hinders the ability to operationalize vulnerability as a theme throughout policing and deliver it as a core business kind of approach. So that's the first observation. Second observation is when you have a closer eye at the definition of vulnerability that the curriculum kind of sets itself to, it uses the College of Policing's single definition. In the slide, if you can see it on the left hand side to the bottom, you can see the definition there. What plays out when you read this and try and understand it is a very wide, general, all-encompassing approach to describing what vulnerability is. And we know from all of the conversations that we have here at LEPH and from our own perspectives, whether it be that practitioners or an academic perspectives or people who use services, vulnerability isn't clear cut, it's complex and it's multifaceted. And with having a generic definition, perhaps this can be really difficult to operationalize and conceptualize in for both academics in designing the curriculum, but also how that learning is transferred into practice for those new trainee officers when they're dealing with trauma and complexity. The final observation that I wanted to make is when you look at the curriculum, you can see that there is a really strong emphasis on vulnerability in the context of policing, rather than vulnerability and what that means for problem solving with partners and an interagency approach. The learning around partners is arguably quite functional. So the curriculum will set out who those partners are and what they do, but they don't take it to the next step and actually facilitate those student officers to actually have conversations with their partners. And I think that's a really crucial aspect of the curriculum that could be developed, because what happens without that is, again, those siloed discussions, and those discussions only taking place in a policing environment. So herein lies maybe an opportunity. We've got this curriculum, we've got this new space, it's evolving, and there is a continued appetite. The curriculum is being evaluated by the college, though. Perhaps we need some more eyes on this. But as this space moves on, I'd say that hopefully there's some opportunity for the curriculum to kind of be, I suppose, thought through in this context, and extending or maybe repositioning vulnerability at the heart of the curriculum. So those conversations can be enabled, can be extended to an interagency approach to learning, where you might have student police officers learning with maybe students in social care, in nursing, in the probation service, and the list can go on, but together, and to problem solve all of the different options, to reflect on practice collaboratively. And Inga mentioned that kind of push and pull, the dilemmas there, understanding the notions of vulnerability and all of the different professional perspectives, and how that plays out in reality in terms of the opposing ways of kind of working, and appreciating and acknowledging and understanding the different frameworks that partners operate within. So these are the kinds of things with an eye over how vulnerability is played out in the curriculum, how if it's shifted to being at the heart of the core business of curriculum, maybe those conversations might change. So I'm just going to move on to Emma. Should I hand over to you?
These are just some questions really that Jenny and I have asked of the curriculum, really, and I think, you know, you've said it all already, Jenny, you know, how important this is. It should thread through the curriculum and not be considered as an add-on, and I do agree, actually. I think this links to, Shelley, what you were saying about procedural justice, because we're also seeing the same thing in the context of procedural justice. It's basically aligned to a module on community policing, when it should be threading through the entire curriculum as a core way of interacting with individuals at every level, whether you're a victim being interviewed by an investigating officer, or whether you're being stopped in your car by a roads police officer. So, you know, I think there's a lot to be thought through. So yes, obviously the first point there is, should really police education be separating vulnerability into a module where it is siloed off, if you like, rather than being at the heart of the curriculum and the opportunity that presents us, you know, as an academic community, to really get that evidence base in, and the importance of that evidence base at the very start of police officers' career. And could that, if it was done properly, really assist with what we talk about all the time, vulnerability being seen as business as usual? You know, most people the police deal with are vulnerable in whatever context they come across them. And I agree with Jen that, you know, perhaps we do need to consider more developing kind of a better approach to understanding interagency working in partnerships, to better understand not just the concepts of vulnerability and the nuances involved and the intersectionalities involved as well, but also how different agencies work and how they perceive a good outcome. That's another issue. I won't go there. And what are we risking if we get this wrong? The threats are enormous, really, in many contexts. So we've probably gone over for 5 minutes, but that's because we get 5 each.
We're not being greedy.
No. So thank you.
Thanks heaps to the two of you. That's very useful. Some questions on my end as well. And I think that after already listening to the four of you, I feel like, you know, appending my whole presentation at the end of it all. And that is without even listening to Robert and Dan. So I can't fathom what's going to happen after those two talk. And I'm delighted to invite the two of them here, because I have huge admiration for the work that the two of them do. Unashamedly, I have to say that the two of them are featured in in the book that Nicole and I are about to publish next month, and that was unashamedly plugged in by Palgrave yesterday on Twitter. And I really love what they bring to the fore, but I'm even more stoked to have them on this panel, because both of them are really respected members of LEPH and of our previously for Rob and still for Don, of our postgraduate cohort, with Rob being the very first recipient of the Thesis Viva Awards at the previous conference in Edinburgh, and Dan being the runner-up. And they had to do go through a very difficult exercise of pitching their research in 5 minutes to a panel of very critical and assertive assessors. So welcome to the both of you. Rob, I can't wait to hear what you're doing.
Thank you, Issa. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel and embarrassing me as well this evening. So the perspective that I wanted to just clarify that I'm bringing to what I'm talking about is the perspective of an interpreter. I don't speak on behalf of deaf people, just to make that clear, but as my role as an interpreter, I do see and kind of empathize with the challenges that deaf people have faced. And so just to give you some background, my research on how interpreters work with the police started with the Justice Signs project. So the focus was, how can interpreters and police officers work better together within suspect interviews? And this was because there's very little research in the area around how deaf people experience and access the police. And what was known was that interpreters don't like working with the police. Police find it very difficult to recruit interpreters. The police need interpreters to work with them. And the reasons were, is that interpreters don't have enough training so that they understand what policing is about, what they need to know about how they conduct interviews, and the way that communication is managed. And so often what happens is when an interpreter walks into an interview suite, they'll undo all of the kind of the planning and the strategies that's put in place to not coerce the suspect into just to allow them speak and give their version of events. But what might happen is that through the interpretation, you'll see that the interpreter is undermining the rapport building, or undermining the appointment of blame. And so so as I was saying, like, research hasn't, there's been very minimal research on how deaf people experience the police. There was some research done in the 90s, and it highlighted the vulnerability that it put deaf people in. So the police didn't always really understand what it meant to be from a linguistic cultural minority. Many police officers would assume that sign languages are universal, that sign languages are, so in a UK context, British Sign Language is just English on the hands. They would often see the deaf person from a medical perspective as someone with learning impairments, or that they just didn't know how to handle someone who was deaf. So in fact, sign languages are languages in their own rights. There's languages, sign languages in every country. Some countries have 2 or 3 sign languages. And so that was the initial criticism of deaf people's experiences of the police. 20 years later, we decided to then do another national review. And so we interviewed police officers, interpreters, deaf people all over the UK. And what I found was that things had changed quite a lot, but I couldn't tell whether or not it was down to training. So a lot of the stuff that's being talked about today about vulnerability being an important point in building partnerships, in how we look at and understand the person's situation. So from what I've been able to find is that there's a real patchwork. Although there's an improvement, it's hit and miss. So there are some police officers that just seem to get it, that they needed to just afford the deaf person a little bit of extra time, or understand that I need to work with the interpreter in order to be able to provide a decent service. But the problem that what we're seeing at the moment is that there's too much of a dependence on interpreters to get things right. And so, for example, there are legislations all around the world. You've got the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, emphasizing the needs on public authorities to recognize the deaf person's rights and take steps to make reasonable accommodation so that deaf people can access public services. And quite often the default solution is let's book an interpreter. And so I can walk in and I find that I can form a better partnership with a police officer when they seem to follow a vulnerability framework where they're affording time and wanting to understand my need as well as the deaf person's need and explain to me how they're going to manage this interaction and unpack what they're trying to do so that I can become a better partner. So I've lost my train. Lost my train of thought.
I wouldn't worry. I'm still fascinated. Just keep going because I'm really enjoying every second of what you were saying.
So that's right. So I can be a good partner, and you can have a police officer that understands vulnerability, but still deaf people are like, this isn't what I want. I want a language concordant service. And so some of the work that we're looking at the moment is, why aren't deaf people part of policing? Why aren't deaf people part of designing policing and delivering policing? Why is the default always the interpreter? And so this is interesting. So vulnerability, framing vulnerability helps partnerships, which we've heard tonight, but there's still that something missing. And I think there's something about that direct interaction, seeing someone that understands my experience as an individual, and that's missing. And so a lot of the work that we do at Heriot-Watt University is about engaging with the deaf community and trying to open doors so that the deaf community become part of research, nothing about us without us, you know, that mentality. And so that's something that we're hoping to move on to next. Thank you, Inga.
Oh, no. Well, I'm going to keep going because Issa's there. So I is going to put her little daughter gone to school. So I am going to just bring back to Dan. Thank you so much, Robert. I could listen to you all day. Dan, might pass on. Was that the right order? On to Dan? Yes, yep. It was.
It was. Thank you. Again, thanks everyone for inviting me here. I feel like I'm an imposter at times, being a police officer and a late comer back into academia, really. But I really want to echo what Jenny and Emma talked about. And this can't be a checkbox. When we look at our community, so in Canada, roughly 20,000 people are incarcerated every day. They all have 100% of those people have one thing in common. They've all dealt with the police at some point in time. The police have interacted with these individuals. We have failed our police officers in educating them on who the justice client is. And I say justice client because oftentimes they're intertwined between victimization, offending, and witnessing. And we have asked, Larry Sherman once said, we teach our police officers about the law and ask them to manage crime. I would expand on that, saying we teach our police officers about the law and ask them to manage crime and offending behavior without understanding who the offenders are, without understanding vulnerability, without understanding trauma, without understanding the fact that you're dealing with people, period, people. My research at the University of Huddersfield and previously at the University of Cambridge in collaboration with the University of Alberta Prison Project has interviewed 800 incarcerated men and women, both in federal and provincial prisons. Federal prisons is 2 years plus a day, provincial prisons is 2 years less a day, and remand where people await trial and sentencing. Consistently, 95 to 96% of people are victims before they're offenders. They're victims throughout their life course. 83 and 84% are victims before offenders in men and women. And their average age of victimization is roughly 9.9 years of age. So we have people that have trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and this is not an excuse that they shouldn't have to be held accountable for crimes they commit, but what it is a factual understanding that the people that we're dealing with have a story before the moment of offending. It's about how do we deal with people in a way that's procedurally just. Shelley brought up procedural justice. How do we do that? How do we interact with people so that they feel that they're a part of their own justice experience? One of my frustrations around evidence-based policing and evidence-based practices is the vast majority of evidence-based policing is quantitative. It's, and that's not, I'm not to besmirch the works of people that I have a lot of respect for, but it's about how do we reduce crime? What's the quantitative? And you are almost impossibly, it's going to be impossible almost to publish a qualitative evidence-based piece in a lot of the journals that publish evidence-based practice. How can we have an evidence base without understanding who? The numbers are important. The stories are more important. And I think mixed methods gets you to that next level. And I think that's where we have to intertwine this in policing. And I also think proximity breeds compassion and love. If I don't know anybody who was an offender, if I don't know anybody who uses substances, if I don't know anybody, then I'm going to have a linear version of what they are. I'm going to decide what they are. I'm going to decide what they need. And I'm going to decide as the police officer what's best for them and what's best for the community. And I'm going to fail. Because what we do is we read chapters 7 to 12, forgetting chapters 1 through 6 in people's stories. And if we do that, we don't have any understanding of what they've been through. When it comes to police training, it can't just be a 46-year-old cop who pretends to be an academic telling them. We need to bring people with us. We need to have people tell their journeys. We need to have people sitting in front of a group of future or existing police officers that tells their story. And if you can sit and listen to, and one of the stories that we use is Cynthia, and Cynthia has come and presented with me. If you sit and listen to Cynthia's first memory of her life, of her being sexually assaulted by her father, of her brother being sexually assaulted to the point where she, to this day, has a visceral reaction when a baby cries, because that's what she remembers about a baby crying, was that her dad was raping him. If you listen to her talk about how her dad would get drunk, load a firearm, and then the kids would have to run out in the field and get shot at, and then move on to, at 13 years old, working the street for survival, as a survival sex trade worker, HIV positive by 15, and then incarcerated in her 20s for assaulting men that were picking her up as a sex trade worker. If you listen to that story and don't have compassion for her, then you shouldn't be in policing. Then you shouldn't be in the system that we work in, because that is the reality of it. And oftentimes we never get to hear it. Oftentimes we don't tell our members. Nobody told me this. Nobody told me this when I started policing. I was told that we're the good guys and the bad guys, and we're the good guys, and there's no opportunity to fail, and we're going to train hard, and we're going to shoot well, and we're going to learn how to fight. Nobody talks about learning how to talk about hard things. Nobody talks about asking that 6-year-old in a house that there was a domestic disturbance, maybe not chargeable, if they're okay. We need to talk to our members about that continuum of care for trauma that goes long beyond the moment that they see these individuals. The other thing, what we see now is we see, and the research is showing that in policing, if you go get help now, there's a lot more support in policing. There's a lot less stigma around mental health in policing, but we're not transferring that into the community because we're the police. Of course, we see all these bad things. Well, go back to Cynthia's story. I just told you a lot of bad things that she experienced from an early age on. How do we not show her the same quarter that we're showing our members inside about getting help? And how do we need to do that by providing opportunities for interaction. We need to do that by providing people an opportunity to spend time with people. I would suggest that out of the 800 individuals that we've interviewed in our research, 10% of them should be in prison. And I would suggest that when I say that, I don't become very popular in certain rooms, but I don't care. Because it's about changing things that need to be true and need to be real and doing things better. Doing things the way we've always done it is wrong. We can't arrest our way to problems, but we also need to start educating our police officers properly. I get so sick of that. We're not social workers. I'm not asking you to be a social worker. I'm asking you to be a police officer with compassion. I've said it before, I've said it at this conference, I look at badges, police badges all over the place. I used to collect them. I have a whole bunch of them in a frame somewhere. They say things like compassion. So they don't say compassion. They say like courage, integrity, community, but they leave out compassion. Compassion is how we interact with people. That's how we become better. That's how we become different. I'm going to probably overshare right now. I had this in me before I became a police officer, because every single one of my friends, for the most part, ended up in jail. When I worked in corrections, I had friends that were on units that I was a CO in, and I was a correctional officer. And yes, is it uncomfortable strip searching one of your best friends? Yeah, it's super weird. But I did it. And I realized very early on that there's not as delineation or differentiation between good and bad that we want there to be. There is just people, and there is just decisions. And I can tell you from a personal perspective, I made bad decisions, but I am a white male whose dad was a cop, and I got a break more than once. And it allowed me to do this job. If I were to be a person of color and whose dad wasn't a cop, I would have probably been in a jail cell at that moment. My life would have changed. So having that background and understanding has allowed me to see this differently. And then going back to school has allowed me to put words to it and hopefully make some changes to it. So I really believe, and we've added some stuff in our curriculum for our recruits, and we've started doing some training with some of our specialized areas, and we're starting to do some training with our membership on what trauma is, on compassion, on victimization and the victim offender overlap, and who the justice client is. And we're trying to find ways to make it so it's not a one-off. And we also want to find ways to research it, ensure that we are effective in the training. We've done a compassion series that we put out onto our internal EPS net, where so far we have 3 individuals who tell their stories. They tell their stories from the moment they remember to the moment that they're in that room, and everything in between. And it soon became the most watched video series that ever was put out by our internal digital media unit, with comments from people that were, I would suggest, I know them quite well, and they're a little bit on the crusty side, saying this is something we should have had a long time ago. And when we start to see comments like that from people that are, these older kind of crusty cops going, we needed to know this before, that to me says there's an anecdotal impact, and we want to make sure that that impact becomes true, and that we know that we're actually doing something good. But we also want to make sure that more than the training, we need to have human-centered design to make the justice experience better for everybody that's in it. And we know that based on all the research on police legitimacy from Tyler, from Tankaby, from Bottoms, if we're seen as legitimate, people reoffend less and offend less. And if we can do that by being compassionate and caring and work with people and see them as people, not as offenders, I hate the term, they're the justice client. And if we can do that, and we can use that qualitative data as a push point for evidence-based practice and policy, and that's how we need to do that, so we can bring that human voice. And I don't like giving a voice, they already have a voice, we just need to elevate it in places that they can be heard. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I'm just going to come out with it and say that Dan makes me cry all the time whenever he tells those stories. This is now at the point where it's tradition that when I know Dan is going to talk, I'm going to shed a tear. Because those stories are really quite moving for me, and I think we do not portray them enough. I'd like to apologize. Other people in the audience are crying. This is your fault, Dan. It's entirely on you. I'd like to apologize to the audience. You saw me sneak out of the session and come back in. My little girl just went to school, and she was a bit sad that I was not driving her this time around. So I went to say goodbye and came back quickly. So I missed a little bit of Rob's presentation. I really apologize for that. So it's my turn to talk, and we've got some questions in the audience. So what I'm going to do is try and make my own contribution to the session quite short, and then give the floor to the people who have asked questions. One of the questions was directed at me, but I think it might have benefit to be answered by some of us on the panel. And one of our very good friend, Donna Evans, wants to ask a question, which I think she should ask live as well. So I'm going to go through my own thoughts as quickly as I can. There were 3 things that I want to make. And I'm really grateful that all of us said all of those things before me, because I think this nicely packages the point that we're trying to make around bringing an evidence base to the field from the point of training and then policy and practice. So there are 3 points that I want to make. First of all, I want to make the point of my utter frustration about hearing stories, either individual stories or research stories over and over again, and noticing how throughout those conferences or in our history of developing the field of law enforcement and public health, those stories are just blown off like candles in the wind. And I think that it's a mistake that we're constantly doing and that we've been doing for a really long time. Because of that, I want to deeply reflect on those stories, either coming from people who have had an experience of the criminal justice system, of the policing system, or of researchers exposed to that and working in the field of vulnerability. And I want to also reflect on those who study those stories. And what I want to do afterwards is propose a bold move forward for more constructive, positive way of doing things. So where does my frustration come from? To talk about the first point. We always talk about good practice and evidence-based practice, but very often what we're being told, and I think that was hinted at by a couple of us today already, is that these stories of good practice are very, very often based on individuals, and how this specific police officer did such a good job with this specific individual and in partnership with this specific social worker or mental health forensic clinician who was doing such an assessment at such a particular time. And so my question, my frustration is, why aren't those stories the foundation of dealing with vulnerability in policing as business as usual? Why don't we have those benchmarks as that as business as usual, as opposed to dissecting problem solving or trying to problem solve on literally operational protocol mistakes? And I'm trying to as I was saying just before, I feel like I want to append my whole presentation because of what all of you have done and some of the statements that you've made in this session, but also some of our colleagues who have spoken throughout the conference since Monday. And I want to highlight that although I'm feeling sometimes frustrated and exasperated, we have to notice that there's been huge progress in that field already, but that sometimes that progress is shadowed by my looking at someone talking or sitting in a government collaborative workshop of some sorts and thinking, well, this is one step forward and 2 steps back. How do we actually keep on moving forward in the most positive of way? So I really think that we need to give more credit to those stories that Dan has just mentioned, and that I'm very honored, very grateful to say that he was kind enough to feature in that book that Nicole and I have coming up. And Donna, actually, who's asked the question on the chat, has also contributed some of them as well. I think those stories need to become foundational. And of course, our very dear colleague, Jeff Thompson, a couple of days ago in the session on police officer mental health, made the really good point that we cannot base practice or evidence-based practice on anecdotal evidence. And I fully agree with this, but I think that we need to get to the hard realization that those stories that Dan just mentioned, for example, they for sure are data points in our collection of evidence, but they are not rare. And we need to get out of that impression that those stories are rare and that all of a sudden, in the midst of all of those, sorry, I'm going to swear, all of those policing fuck-ups that we see at the moment in social media and mass media, when we see police officers using really unreasonable force or reacting quite badly to an event or really badly interacting with a person, all of a sudden we've got this gem of a police officer who's really sophisticated in his or her or in their let me be gender correct here, in their interaction with a person in crisis, really, really sophisticated and compassionate then in their interaction with a person who's really in distress. I fundamentally believe that we actually do have a critical mass of those stories that we're not exploiting. Dan has probably volumes of notes on those stories. I've got volumes from my own empirical work. Nicole surely has as well. Shelley, you must have countless stories in social work. Inga in mental health, Rob in your own interpretation services, and Emma and Jenny in our research as well. We do have excellent examples of excellence in policing and in collaborative practices. Why are we not using this? And I really do think that those examples are legion and that we're not exploiting them in the right way. So I want to propose that we actually change our way to collect evidence, and instead of having a grant or looking at, oh, well, that's a really big mistake that was made by a police officer or a social worker or someone else, instead of trying to solve those problems constantly, why don't we constantly instead document good practice, build on this, and generalize it? I love the idea that of Dale McPhee's department putting together a spreadsheet of how police officer mental health is being treated at the moment, and then backtracking those events in order to design preventative options for those police officers to build on their mental health and well-being. I truly believe that, and I said that in the session, a police officer who's well and healthy will be able to do better work than a police officer who suffers and is in denial of PTSD as well. That's another issue altogether around vulnerability. But this is the kind of stuff that I want to say. We need to collect all of those stories, all of those good stories of police officers and public health practitioners. So those police officers who excel at facilitating public health process, and document the work of health practitioners who excel at facilitating public safety. And then from that, we need to find patterns and reverse engineer those patterns. Those stories of good outcomes, good practice, really they're not few. And if we all have some of those exemplars in our empirical notes, what we need to do really is just blow out the iceberg out of the ocean, really, and stop dealing with the tipping point of that iceberg, as opposed to what we're doing here. And I have to say that in saying all of this, and I want to be constructive and find a way that promotes evidence, a good evidence that will guide practice in the long term. I think that what works needs to become our motto, rather than constantly going back to downgrading the description of a data point to, oh, that's just anecdotal evidence. I think there's huge negative stigma in dealing with those stories, and that stigma is actually wrongly pitched. There is actually very little, and I think Dan said that, there's very little available on good practice, because we often research gaps. And I think that we've been trapped in solving problems as opposed to researching what cops do, what nurses do, what paramedics do, what nurses, police, and paramedics do together, and that worked well. With a caveat, though, that people like Amy Watson and Jen would do that really well in the field of mental health crisis intervention teams, which I think is one of the fields that we need to dissect in terms of what is their research process. And of course, they solve problems, but they've got a huge evidence base of good practice going on there. Why don't we do that in the field of autism? Why don't we do that in the field of translation services or sign language and all those kinds of things? So and in saying all of this, and I want to say that I'm a bit negative in my comment, because I promised everyone that I wanted to end on a rant. But I feel very privileged to work in a police organization where the police officers are, 99% of the time really good at what they do, really good at communicating. I probably should give myself a little bit of credit there because I am in charge of their vulnerability training, and I have probably put the fear of God in them by talking to them and telling them, if you don't do that, I will haunt your nightmares. But the idea is that Nicole and I are in control of that vulnerability curriculum, and I feel very privileged that all of the police instructors at the Tasmania Police Academy have said, why don't we have all of that vulnerability training trickling down throughout all of the modules? So in as much as I talk to them about vulnerability in the module that is dedicated to that, they talk about vulnerability from the point of view of legal protocol from law, handcuffing, drug and search procedures, and all those kinds of things. So we've got, in a way, that kaleidoscopic perspective in vulnerability training at the police academy that I think makes up for really, really good groundwork. But I'm listening to you all talk, and I added some notes to my spreadsheet going, can I do better from that point of training? So what we do at the moment, when I tell you that we're trapped into dissecting problems, vulnerability problems, and problematic police interaction with vulnerable people, I think we're trapped in that vicious circle at the point of training too, where basically in class what we do, and I've sat with police educators, police officers who are police educators, who teach police recruits, and they show a problem interaction and they dissect that interaction and they ask those recruits, what went wrong? What do you think went wrong? What would you do? But what would you do as per protocol? This is not about protocol. And I think, Dan and Shelley, you were absolutely right in what saying. This should not be about protocol. This should be about procedural justice. This should be about ameliorating the experience of the person at that point of interaction, specifically here. I want to wrap up and start, and I can see that some questions are coming in, so I want to give the floor to the audience. But my really big questions are, can we please showcase good practice and dissect it and build on this, as opposed to constantly hammering the problems that we see either on TV or sometimes in our research as well? Is this one of the ways that we reconcile some of the things that have been said by all speakers here today at the session and in some of the other sessions at the conference? So how do we embed that evidence in Inga's point about dynamic partnerships that come at policy level, but also at operational level? Shelley's point about teaching together. I would love to teach together, have social workers talk about procedure and talk about interaction and share their experience. Have more people at the police academy talk about their lived experience with police officers, knowing that there are issues around insurance, of course, along those lines. But look, why not? How do we reconcile, of course, that teaching can we teach multidisciplinarily, in the police academy, or are we asking too much for our recruits right now at that point of their training? But I'm really keen to flesh out Emma and Jenny's point about making vulnerability business as usual, in as much as I am about making Rob's point about communication and mediators of communication a center core of our training. Rant over in saying this. So my point really is that we need to build more on the tip of that iceberg that we've got around good evidence and interactions, and featuring what a real interaction looks like in police training, but a real good interaction, a positive interaction, and build on that. We need to showcase more at the point of training and then upwards how things can go well and what are the various processes that are at stake when things go well in those interactions. So I'm going to go through some of the questions that have been asked, but can I ask any of the panelists if they have something to say before I give them the floor to the audience?
Can I just say something quickly?
Yes, Inga, you raise your hand.
It was just around that, the notion of it being procedural for officers around the vulnerability and what's out with procedure and what is core business. And certainly in my research, I interviewed quite a number of police officers, and I was overwhelmed by the level of compassion. And I also interviewed a whole heap of nurses. I was really overwhelmed by how lack of compassion there was. So there was this real difference between people. But when I was interviewing the police officers, I had to really dig to get the story around the compassion, because it was like almost showing their vulnerability, that they had shown compassion, and that it wasn't their job to be that. And there was one particular officer I remember we were discussing a really quite a difficult case, an overdose that he'd been working with. The lady had bitten him quite badly, and he'd been lots and lots of problems. Anyway, he talked through the procedural process of that, and I said, "Oh, was that the end of your shift?" It was a really long shift, and he said, "Oh yeah, it was." And the lady had gone off in the ambulance in the end. It was a long story, but he said, "Yeah, but I went back to her flat and I cleaned up all the vomit, because his shift had finished." But he said, "I couldn't have faced the fact that she was going to get discharged home the next day, and her house would be a mess, and she'd have to come home to that." And I was just, he'd gone after his shift to clean up this lady's house who had harmed him. But I had to dig for that. And he was almost embarrassed by compassion. He was embarrassed by his soft, he saw it and said, "Oh, I'm just being soft." No, no, you're not. And so I think there's something there about what police think is business as usual, and how do you dig underneath that? Because I think it's there. I think there is compassion there. It's just from an organizational perspective, it's sometimes not allowed to be shown.
I would agree with that, Inga. I think probation officers are sometimes ridiculed, and prison officers too, and actually disparagingly called care bears if they actually care about the people they're meant to take care of. So I think there is a culture of putting that down. It's the toxicity in the culture a bit.
And I love that term that who was it? Somebody spoke about the soft skills, and officers speak about their soft skills, and I'm thinking, no, they're amazing skills, and they're so hard to have. Yeah. But just one very brief thing, just on interdisciplinary learning, because I also hold the hat for interdisciplinary learning in our school, and I was just approached our nursing partners, because I teach in nursing, around developing interprofessional learning with police. And when I went out to practice to speak with the senior nurses, they said, "Yeah, but we don't work with police." And I went, "You do? Yeah, you do." And they went, "Yeah, if you work in A&E," and they named the places, and they were absolutely right. If you work in intensive care, or if you work in a big hospital, unless you're working in A&E, you very rarely will come face to face with a police officer. And so they didn't see the value in learning with police officers, because for the majority of the nursing workforce, they didn't see, whereas police see vulnerable, police see physical health and mental health all the time, problems, and so it's in their face. Whereas nursing, we don't see police work in our face, very rarely. And so I think we might have a bit of a trouble. I mean, I already teach across a module with police and nurses in it. I've sort of done quite a lot of big interprofessional education events with police and health. And it's not easy. It's not easy at all. And so I think you've finding the value for health to be learning with police has to be switched on. They see it from a voyeurism perspective. They think it's really interesting and really sexy to work with the police. I mean, there's nothing much sexy working with the police, is there? But, oh, sorry, police officers. But, I think there's a bit of an ill fit that we need to work around to make interprofessional education work. Because putting people in the room together to learn together it's not always going to, it's got to maybe be bits. Sorry, that's my rant over.
Can I just make a couple of observations, Issa? Sorry. just really quickly, because I know we haven't got that much time, but I've really enjoyed this panel. First of all, it's been an absolute honour to be here with all of you. Thank you for organising it, Isa. But it's been really refreshing hearing from all of you about the importance of narratives, I have to say, because I actually think, and I, like Dan, I'm not trying to put some of my colleagues, work down in any way around the evidence-based policing mantra that is certainly working its way through the UK. But sometimes actually the What Works agenda can refocus our attention to crime. And crime fighting outcomes. And actually what we're talking about here is officers being valued for the softer skills, rather than going out and doing what we consider to be the traditional paradigm of policing. And I honestly think that we've got to start to listen more to the narrative in the evidence base. And the other part of what I was going to say was there is another win-win in doing that, because it encourages officers to reflect on their practice. So we don't just pick up those cases where they've done a good job, but also cases where the outcome hasn't been as they would have liked, so that they can use that as a fundamental learning process where they review what they've done and also share things that perhaps haven't gone as well and could have been improved. So it's looking at the evidence in a different way, but also encouraging a much more kind of organizational learning approach to what we do in this kind of space. So that's been really interesting, I think, that debate here today. I've really enjoyed it, and I know some comments have come up in the audience as well.
Yeah. I want to make a point as well that I think that in terms of stigma, one of the stigmas that we need to address relatively quickly around communication, that if you can't communicate with a person you're interacting with, this is not going to go well. And in the first place, if they can't understand you, or if they can't hear you, Rob, of course, you're going to have a huge issue trying to get anything done. And it so occurs that we're working at the moment with Nicole on the translation services, translation and interpretation services here in Tasmania. None of our police officers use it. None of it. Why? And of course, sign language either. In the context of vulnerability, oh well, then Dan goes, in the context of vulnerability, of course, this is completely inappropriate. But what's happening here is that we've got police officers who are fearful of being perceived as incompetent at communicating. That is not about the competence or not. It is about channeling the messages and creating a two-way relationship at that very particular point in time. And that is what I found absolutely fascinating in Shelley's presentation as well. When we talk about legitimacy and capacity to do all of those things, at the end of the day, that legitimacy comes down to that particular point in time, where if you're not able to show compassion, to communicate properly, or to reach out to those who will be able to channel all of that, you will get zero good practice done at that stage. And that to me is absolutely infuriating. I'm becoming infuriating again. I need to stop. This is too early in the morning for that. All right, let's get to the questions and to the panel. I want to give the floor to Donna Evans. Donna, can you please raise your hand so we can unmute you, please? Donna has a question specifically about how, Donna, if you're still here, how civil societies, a civil society organization can help support vulnerable people during their engagement with police on those issues as they arise. And she's making the point that some of us have made before, that the policing structures have to be very protocol driven and sometimes can hinder the engagement process, and that can hinder the engagement process. Donna, are you still here? Hi, Donna. You're unmuted, so you can talk now. But we can't hear you. Or maybe we can now. No, let's try, Donna, let's work on your technology issues, but let's take and we'll circle back to you. In the chat and in the Q&A, there were some questions also asked by Patricia Griffin around wisdom-based research, which I think is really interesting, and that I want, like Emma, I want to hear about this too. Jennifer Chambers speaks about the Empowerment Council that has created some awards to police officers who do particularly well in the area of mental health. I love that. You know, rewards are, you know, it's the kinds of things that we need to do to promote good practice, really. And we have a little bit of time to answer all of those questions as well. Isa De Jong asked a question around definitions of vulnerability and victimization in the specific context of mental health, which I think would be good to answer, particularly by Inga and Shelley. What is the definition of victimization in mental health encounters as well, which is important because we've always spoken about the need to establish for evidence-based to occur, evidence-based practice to occur, to establish a broad-based terminology and a consensual terminology as well. So Donna, I'm happy to deal with all of those comments and questions, unless we can hear from you, Donna, now? Yes, yes.
I guess with the PhD research I'm doing at the moment, I'm interviewing a range of people, including civil society advocates and policing experts. Some of those issues are coming up about society not being in the right spaces to be even aware of opportunities to engage constructively with police. So
Donna, can I interrupt you just for a sec? Can you come closer to your microphone? There's a lot of interference in your.
Okay, sorry. I think it is the internet.
Perfect.
We're still struggling. Yeah. With the PhD research I'm doing at the moment, I'm interviewing a number of policing experts and also civil society advocates, and a couple of the issues that are coming up quite frequently from different participants is the difficulty for civil society in understanding the opportunities and engagement points to constructively engage with police, so that the engagements aren't always, when there's a crisis, confrontational, blaming, those sorts of engagements. So it can be very difficult, particularly in, say, South Africa, where I was working to even unravel the protocols and the hierarchies, and to actually identify champions within the policing and law enforcement organisations to actually start talking with and embedding, you know, a more public health orientated approach to things. The other thing that is coming from law enforcement members themselves is that with the community expectations that crime is happening, the community expects that people will be arrested. There will be repercussions and consequences for those behaviours. So it's in a very difficult position where they might pick up a member who perhaps might be a person who uses drugs, remove them from the environment, take a more public health orientated approach, and then the community is basically pressuring police immediately about the return to drug use at that location. So I think, as well as the actual training within the police and sensitisation of the police, those sort of external communications and engagements also perhaps.
We've lost you on those last words, Donna. But Shelley unmuted, so I think she wants to address some of your points.
No, I didn't actually. I'm sorry. I just unmuted because my children have finally gone to school, so it's quiet now. But was there particular points you think I could address there, Isa? I didn't catch all of it, to be honest. It kept coming in and out on my audio.
What I found really interesting in Donna's comments was around dissecting the points of intervention and finding the points of engagement and communication at those specific points, which is, I think, some of the things that Robert and Dan were talking about, and what you were talking about as well, that point of interaction where everything comes down the track. So I had jotted down a question here actually for you. This one here, just here. How do we go about dissecting that interaction point and finding those engagement components that Donna's mentioning in her comment?
Well, I think if I just speak to training and education for a moment on that. So one of the things that I was involved with at Monash University when I was working on the Masters of Social Work program was putting together practice-based teaching opportunities and learning opportunities for students. So my area was particularly focused on work integrated learning and what students actually do in the moment of communication with another person. And we looked at what general practitioners do in their training, where they use what's called OSCEs for their assessments, so observed structured clinical exams. And building on the work again of Marion Bogo from Toronto University, who has adapted these for social work, we introduced that to Monash University's program as well. So we trained actors in being the client, the justice client. I love that term, Dan. I think that's fits really well. Social workers often use the term client. It's not without its problems, but it's certainly better than offender. And we had social work students were given a very short scenario. So it might be that they're in a drug and alcohol setting, or maybe in a prison, or maybe in some other hospital setting, you name it. And they've got a client in front of them. They don't know much more than that, because in all honesty, that's often about the level of handover you get. If you get one, sometimes you have a case file, sometimes you don't, sometimes you just walk into the situation. And they would then have to, for 10 minutes, engage with the client. That's the sole purpose of the interaction, is to build rapport and engage. So it's about setting the scene that this is a safe space, this is trust. You might not actually get to identifying what the person's problem is, because in all honesty, sometimes people don't know themselves what their problem might be. And so we would then have some experienced examiners watching this interaction, so observing what was happening, and then dissecting the specific skills that the student would be demonstrating. So one example would be, for example, modeling emotional regulation. So not if a client's very distressed, not matching that level of stress, but modeling the level of calm that you're hoping the client will achieve. So those basic de-escalation techniques. And I note that in the chat there was a question about, do these soft skills work in truly crisis-driven moments? Well, I would say if you think about the most crisis-driven moments, often hostage negotiations and things like that, who do they roll in? They roll in skilled communicators and skilled negotiators. So absolutely, it's entirely about the soft skill. And I said in the comments earlier, maybe we need to rebrand these as hardcore skills, because they're hard to do. They do require practice. We don't give them enough time in most curriculums, in most university courses. And I might say that's potentially because we often focused on academics who are very skilled writers, very skilled theorists, very good talkers, but maybe not so good at the practice themselves, or out of practice in some cases. So we don't emphasize that in the people who are teaching these skills in the first place. And we've been rewarding academics for a long time in our university systems with publications and citations, as opposed to how well they're doing in their teaching and what impacts that's actually having. It's not as easily measured. So there's a lot of problems in those systems in the first place as to how this gets translated. So I think that idea of using simulated scenarios and looking for the good practice is really critical here. And picking up on your point earlier, Isa, about analysing stories for good practice, I often think back to my time as a pool lifeguard, where I learned from somebody else not to say, don't run around the side of the pool, but instead to say, please walk. So rather than just saying, don't do this behavior, that's not good practice. You tell and have to explain what is good practice. What does that look like? Which actually opens up a much more complex and nuanced conversation. And it's much more difficult sometimes to identify that. And I think, yeah, I would agree with you, focusing on what good practice is and what we want it to look like and putting our energies into that is a really valuable way forward. So I hope I've addressed the question enough in those points.
And I just want to give Donna's apology, who just emailed me. She is in one of the flooded areas in Australia at the moment, so she's it's still not going on. We've had a massive weather event on the east coast of Australia over the past 5 days. So we've got massive flooding in a number of areas. So Donna, we wish you well. We hope you're safe and well. And that's why the technology was not working quite well there. Patricia, are you still online? And if you're with us, can you raise your hand so we can so we can have a chat to you? Because Emma and I would really love to hear about your wisdom-based research. Well, Emma and I and Inga and Rob and everyone really.
Yeah.
Well, it's just been wonderful to hear you all, and it's so great to join you from Philadelphia area. So I wish you were all here with me as well. But it's been great to spend time with you. I was trained in federal law enforcement as a federal law enforcement officer in the United States, and I completed 14 weeks of training. But then I was partnered up with a special agent that I basically was like a little puppy dog following this agent for a good 6 months while I was on probation. And it was more or less like a mentoring type of process. And that happens quite frequently in policing in the United States. And I don't know if that's the case globally, but a new recruit is placed out into the field, and that new recruit kind of learns from the experience of that more senior officer. And then you may get partnered up with someone else as you become more specialized, but really it is that mentoring approach. So as I've been, I guess, fast forward now some 35 years later in academia, I've become much more concerned about this term, evidence-based practice, because much like I've heard everyone here speak today, it's like in the fields where I work, which is really police and community health and wellness and drug court processes, evidence-based in a quantitative way does not get to the heart of what we see as the value of these programs, right? So it caused me to start exploring wisdom-based practices. And I saw that really emerging in the Aboriginal research and culture studies. And it just intrigues me that we are not integrating that more. So as we think about how we might enrich our disciplines and sort of like establish the value of the work that we're doing, myself, and again, this is all very new, past couple of months, because I'm just sort of like, I feel like I'm pounding my head against the wall saying, stop using evidence-based when you are only really restricting the evidence I'm gathering. There's so many more stories out there. So it's kind of like taking the wisdom, not just of the community members, but of our officers, right? I feel like we have this really kind of, at least in the US, an established practice of partnering up our recruits or our young agents with more senior agents. Sometimes you get good habits, sometimes you get not very good habits, right? But at the same time, there is this passing of information. So how can we build on that tradition? Because we know law enforcement and policing agencies are very, very kind of stuck often in their ways of doing things. So it's sort of like using this little window or like an established practice to say, okay, so wisdom is something that you value in a policing organization. Wisdom, but though, so we build upon that concept of wisdom to say there's wisdom in the community as well as wisdom in our senior officers, if that makes sense. So anyway, I'm just going to start trying to explore that, kind of test it out. I work very closely with the Philadelphia Police Department and with the head of the training unit there. I have quite a few police officers in the greater Philadelphia area who try to leverage their sort of state police training curricula to earn college level credits. And so I'm trying to see how I can tease out this concept of wisdom-based evidence as opposed to evidence-based practice. So anyway, just thought I'd share that because I know I almost like my first year in law enforcement, federal law enforcement, I had to, again, I was like a puppy dog, and my performance evaluations were along the lines of chews gum too loudly in the surveillance van. It was like, oh, wait a minute, what, right? Or walked too swiftly in a doing an undercover surveillance. It's like, so somebody was paying attention to the way I carried myself, right? So they were picking up on the way in which I fit into the culture of the community. How about we try to get that same thing and then reverse engineer it, like, hey, the community has this wisdom. Let's see what we can bring back into the academy. So anyway, just something to share. Thank you. But thanks everyone. You've really energized me.
Thanks, Patricia. It's always wonderful to talk to you on that front. I've got ideas for books and articles, and I'm not going to get. I reckon I'm not going to get that done in my lifetime, really. But it's really interesting because we seem to, unless I'm completely misinterpreting everything that I've heard this morning, we seem to be in agreement in terms of the kinds of things that can help boost an evidence-based practice for the field, and that at the forefront of that evidence-based platform is narratives and experience, and the experience of both the practitioners, either in law enforcement or public health, but also those who receive those services at that point of interaction as well, throughout the whole continuum of interaction. There's sorry, Jenny, I just saw your comment. Just can unmute yourself, so everyone now, and just come through. Always evidence informed, never evidence-based policing. What do you mean?
Oh,
Jenny?
we were just debating, weren't we, what on the panel chat around Patricia's point around sort of that wisdom-based approach, and we were talking rather than that kind of quantifiable the EBP stuff. It's actually termed better in the context of evidence-informed practice.
Yes,
that's the context. Sorry, it was a little private chat with the panelists.
But I like that. Sorry, Shelley.
I was just going to say, I think that interrogation of the term evidence is really important. And, you know, there's a lot of areas of practice that don't lend themselves well to a narrow understanding of evidence. And I think it has been a very traditional biomedical model of evidence that we're talking about, which is really useful for clinical trials and really useful in a particular context. But we don't work in laboratory contexts. You know, policing and social work and all these other fields don't happen in these closed off, well-contained environments. They happen in big open environments where there's lots of chaos and complexity. And so we actually need methodologies and evaluations that can take some of that into account. And of course, randomized controlled trials don't work so well in those spaces and environments. So we need a fit for purpose approach and methodologies that we're thinking about. And that's where narratives, of course, are really critical. And I agree with some of the criticisms around anecdotalism. We also don't want to fall into that trap. But if you think about minority groups, they're greatly disadvantaged if we're always saying that small sample groups and things like that are not worth listening to or paying attention to. That means anyone in a minority will never get their lived experience taken into account or valued. So that argument doesn't carry weight when you look at it through an ethical lens. And ethics and morals are important in this space too. We don't talk about that enough. So that's my little rant on the corner.
I'm really conscious of time. This is so interesting. I think just also on the EBP point, and I'm, you know, we're not giving it well, we are giving it a bit of a slating, I guess. But the other thing is that evidence-based work generally is only as good as the data that it's using. And we all know that police data, quality of the police data is really bad. I mean, Jenny and I are involved in a Pathfinder project at the moment with a small force in the UK around rape investigation and attrition in rape cases, which is all about vulnerability, to be honest. And the quality of the data that they're using to develop their problem profiles and their analytical products is really not worth the paper it's written on, to be honest. And those are the data sets that inform the basis of evidence-based policing in its traditional sense. And that, to me, ethically, aside from all the other ethical stuff that we could go into, is really dodgy. But I'll stop there because I might go off on one.
I totally agree, Emma, and I think that problem of big data research doesn't address that enough. I think in principle it's a fabulous idea, and I love the idea of making connections and having continuity of care pathways. I think all of that is really, really important. But you're right, I've seen also who the probation officers are and the prison officers are that are entering the data in correction settings. They don't care. They don't give two hoots on the whole, or really necessarily aren't part of that knowledge translation pathway. So don't see what happens to it at the other end, and just put anything in there. And that's the quality of the data that you're left with. So it's a really quite an enormous and complex problem that doesn't get acknowledged enough. So.
Too difficult box.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, that's right. That's right. I'm quite conscious of the time as well, and we've now been talking for 2 hours. This is wonderful. We could keep, this is like a live, a face-to-face conference, isn't it? We keep on talking, and Sarah really is the only one who has any power to make a stop. As opposed to someone ringing a bell to tell us that we're going over time. Thank you, Sarah, for being a lovely moderator on that front. She's been telling me, if you want more time, you can have more time. But I'm conscious that it's really late where you are, Emma, Inga, and Robert and Jenny. And in as much as Shelley and I are about to go our own way and go about our day, you probably need to get a little bit of sleep. So we've got another 30 minutes. Hi, Yasmin. I'm so glad to see you, Yasmin. I'm delighted to say that Yasmin is my co-chair on the special interest group on education. She's absolutely lovely. Clearly, if she's here listening to us, she still hasn't had her baby. Come on, baby, you've got 1 more week to go. And so we do have time if we want to talk more, but I'm quite aware that some of you might want to head off. Dan had to go because he had to take a call for work as well. So I'm quite happy to wrap up if you would like. If we are on that wrapping up path, then I would really like to go around the panel again for everyone to have a few final words, if you don't mind. Rob, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. I feel like I come as an outsider, and what I find really helpful and useful is that a lot of the stuff that you're talking about in terms of soft skills, we need interpreters also to develop the soft skills. And often I see police officers as very similar to what we do as interpreters. They mediate information from one source to another. And so there's a lot of common experiences. And I also think that the field of interpreting in how we analyze data and analyze interaction and criticize these interactions so that they can be better and so interpreters can do better. I also think that there's a lot of exchange learning that we can benefit from each other with policing. So I've just found this very useful because I'm sitting here thinking, yes, it's the same for interpreting. And so thank you very much for including me. You're on mute.
Thank you, Robert. We feel privileged to have you with us. Emma, would you like to be next? No?
Yep, I'm here. I've got so much written down from that panel, I have to say. I really, really enjoyed it, and well done for organising it and for somehow just making all of the different people's words fit together so well without much practice, I have to say. So no, I really have. And I think the debate we've had around what counts as evidence, the critical nature of narratives, both from the people who are experiencing the contact with the police and the police themselves has just come shining through, really. And also the link that has with the way we view evidence, but also the way that we apply it in practice and how we learn from different types of evidence. It's been really good, and I think I'm going to go away in some way trying to think how I can write all this up because it's been so brilliant. I've really enjoyed it. As a thank you. I've learned a lot too from everybody, all the panelists. So yeah, thank you, and I hope you audience have enjoyed it as much as I have.
Thanks, Emma. Shelley?
Oh, look, I feel like I've already taken my share of airtime. I've really enjoyed this panel as well. And a bit like you, Robert, I sometimes wonder what am I doing as a social worker on this panel, but I've really seen the connections so strongly. And I often actually say to my student social workers that they ought to think of themselves as interpreters, because in many ways that's their role, that's their function. They never know who they're going to come across in their work. And so their role is to try to understand and try to make connections and build rapport. And I really think there's just so much to be learnt from that moment of human connection and interaction that we're all often trying to do. And I think back to my own time studying German many years ago, which hasn't served me much purpose these days, but being bunked in with somebody where we couldn't speak the same native language, but we had to communicate in German together, and how much we used our bodies and our facial expressions and objects in the room or whatever to try to talk and communicate. And I think if we put in even just a quarter of that effort in the space of law enforcement and public health, we'd see a marked improvement. And hopefully, as Dan had said, you might get the outcome where only the 10% that really need containment are actually getting containment, as opposed to the enormous numbers that are in prisons and other institutions in our law enforcement systems. And particularly, I think too, when you look at the massive overrepresentation of, in Australia at least, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it really shows how what the breakdowns are systemically. And how much work there still is to be done in that, and what an important role I think education and training can really play as a starting point only, because I think Patricia's point about what happens once you go into the workforce and what was happening in work integrated learning is also important with student placements too. A large part of what students learn on their placements is not just what they should do in practice, but also what they shouldn't do in practice. But again, when there's just a gap and it isn't filled with examples of good practice, then you have the continual problems that we're seeing now. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. Inga?
Just to echo the sentiment that I've heard on this panel, it's just, I've loved being on, just learning from everybody. In the last couple of hours, I've taken so many notes because I've learned so much from people, that I thought I kind of knew anyway, I knew, but I just learned so much when we start getting that dialogue. And and thank you so much. That sort of nugget of wisdom about the soft skills is going with me into class tomorrow. I'm teaching first thing in the morning, and that's coming with me. So I'd love for us to, just as a way forward, to think about maybe theming that some of the issues that have come through here, maybe developing another event or a webinar that we could maybe develop, and particularly around Shelley's idea around the interprofessional learning. I would love to do some work on how we can start teasing out some of that to maybe come up with a model that, or to start thinking about models that actually work for all, for social work, police and health in their different curriculums. And also building on that, the idea of working in academia, where is that practice learning valued when it's not always in papers. And so I'd love to do some work around that if we can. And then maybe something else at another point, with police officers and maybe nurses and social, around thinking about what those soft skills are. what are they? Because believe it or not, they're not taught very well in nursing. And you'd think, oh my God, do you know, we don't call it that. And we don't name it as well. And so it's not unusual that it's not named in policing either.
No, that's true.
So there's so much to learn. Oh, I've got a bit Mary Poppins again now. Oh, I'll shush.
Jenny?
I'm just laughing. Mary Poppins. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I can add really anything more to everyone else's reflections. It's been a fabulous experience having these conversations today, and thanks Isa for arranging it all and fitting it kind of all together. And like everyone else, I've scribbled on pieces of paper. I think for me, in my role at the university, I think one of the again, mirrored with what Inga said around the kind of soft skills. You know, when we're framing and looking at the curriculum, we see, as explained, some of the complexities of the curriculum with vulnerability. We see a kind of a modular approach to these kind of for communication skills. And yet it's just totally taken out of the context of which we've talked about it today. And I think that's something for me, I've got responsibility as someone designing the curriculum to think about that a little bit more. And the compassion that that Dan was talking around with sort of bringing to life some of those real stories really, and how that plays out for police officers, and try to weave that reality into the curriculum a little bit more. So I've had a really rich experience today, and just thanks so much. It's been great.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for your very kind words. I think we should wrap up now. In closing, I'd like to say that I feel so privileged to count you as my colleagues and friends. As you could see, members of the audience, we actually get along quite well. We've been working together for a while now, and I feel a bit emotional at not being able to be with you. This is, of course, the horrible worldwide circumstances make us that we're all in our little corner of the world, but it's always a privilege to talk to you. And as Emma, you were saying on Twitter, the brain is refired every single time that I interact with every single one of you, or every single time I read one of your papers. I feel so honored that you, first of all, accepted to be on this panel, and feel so privileged to be able to be part of such rich, enthusiastic, and positive discussions towards really what I see as a better future for evidence-based in law enforcement and public health. As Shelley was saying on the chat, I think that is only the first conversation out of many that we'll have in the future, and that we might actually have to reconvene by email and decide what we do about all of this. And you know, the kids probably being asleep or somewhere while I try to phrase a coherent email, and not being you know, disturbed by people yelling because I'm making them eat banana or the wrong kind of cereals before they go to school. Patricia, I would love to come and see you. I think the next conference might be in the UK though, or somewhere in Europe, if we can travel. And I hope to see you there, Patricia. I know I will see you on the board of LEPH in April, but it's still not the same. Sarah, thank you so much for being the most wonderful host and for energizing us before we started this session for real. You've been absolutely great. Thank you for everyone at LEPH and Hoover. It's a really nifty little app to organize an online conference, I think. So thank you very much for all. I have learned heaps as well. I think that you have really toned down my frustration, my initial frustration, and I can see that there is a path forward, and there is hope for much better work, much more constructive, positive work, where we can better portray the good experience of good police officers and the great experience of our public health practitioners in our field. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Sarah, can we please copy the chat and the question and the Q&A? Would you mind unmuting? Hi, Sarah.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, if you want to stay on too after for a quick second also.
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much all. I wish you the best of days and the best of evenings for those of you who are finishing Thursday where you are, and a lovely weekend for all those of us who are really working on a Friday. Have a lovely end to the conference. I do have a big announcement at the end of today for the conference, because we do have a student award to give. So that will be on Huva very soon. It's not you, Robert, you've had one already. So enough of being a star, you know, you need to pass on the flame to someone else. Have a lovely day, everyone. Again, it's been a privilege to be on the panel with you all. See ya. Bye-bye.